Marin tied the last knot of the night into her prayer cord in the dark of her cell, working it blind by feel, the way she had worked it every night for 4 years, and she did not make a sound, because she had not made a sound in 4 years, because the grey house kept the vow of silence, and Marin, who had not chosen the vow, and had not chosen the house, and had not chosen a single thing about the 4 years of her life, kept it anyway, and had made of the keeping the one thing in her captivity that was still, secretly, entirely her own. She pulled the knot tight against the others, a small hard knot, the newest of a great many, the cord grown heavy with them now, thousands of them. A knot for every night she had knelt on the cold stone of her cell and prayed in the silence for a rescue that had not come. And she ran her thumb back along the length of the cord in the dark, over the knots, over the years, the way she did every night before she slept, reading them like a blind woman reads a face. 4 years of knots, 4 winters of them. Somewhere far down the cord, worn smooth now with handling, were the first knots, the frantic, desperate knots of a girl of 18 who had truly believed, that first year, that someone would come, that the world could not simply lose her into a silent house on a grey headland at the end of the earth and forget she had ever existed. And nearer her fingers were the newer knots, the knots of the woman she had become, tied not from belief anymore, but from something harder and stranger. A discipline, a refusal, a nightly insistence made to a God she was no longer sure was listening, and to a world she was no longer sure remembered her. I am still here. I have not broken. Tie another. Sleep, wake, tie another. She was 22 years old, and she had been 4 years in the grey house of the Silent Sisters, and there was not a soul in the wide world who knew that the mute grey figure who tended the herb beds and rang no bell and spoke no word, had been, once, the betrothed of a king, and had never, in 4 years of praying for it in the silence, stopped meaning to get herself back. To understand the woman knotting her cord in the dark, you have to understand the girl who was carried to the grey house against her will, and the theft that put her there, and it is a theft Marin had turned over so many thousand nights in the silence that she could recite it to herself without heat now, the way you recite a thing that has stopped being a wound and become instead a simple hard fact of the world's arrangement. She had been born Marin of Ashcombe, the only child of the Lord of Ashcombe, a small rich holding of orchards and mills and good river land in the soft country to the south, and for 18 years she had been the heir of it, a quick, bright, well-loved girl with a whole ordinary future laid out plain before her. Her mother had died when Marin was small, so it had been the two of them, Marin and her father, all through her growing. A grave, gentle, careful man who had raised his daughter to know every field and mill and tenant of Ashcombe as her own, because he meant her to have it, all of it, and to keep it well. And in the last good year, when Marin was 17, her father had done the thing a careful lord does for an only daughter, and a small rich holding surrounded by larger, hungrier ones. He had made her a great match, an alliance, a betrothal to the one power in the region strong enough to keep Ashcombe safe forever. To Cassian, the young alpha king of the wold, whose hard northern wolf kingdom overshadowed the whole soft south, and whose protection, bought with a marriage, would make Ashcombe untouchable. It was a political thing, arranged between a careful father and a young king's envoys, and Marin had met her betrothed only twice before the world came apart. But she remembered the 2 meetings, had held them in the silence for 4 years, because the young Alpha King had not been what a girl braces for in a political husband. He had been grave and quiet and watchful, older in the eyes than his years, and he had spoken to her, at their second meeting, not as a lord inspecting a bought bride, but as one person genuinely trying to learn another, asking her about Ashcombe, about the mills, about what she loved, and listening to the whole of the answer. And Marin, 17, had gone away from that second meeting thinking, with a cautious, unlooked-for gladness, that the arranged thing might turn out to be a good thing, that she might come to the Walda a stranger, and find, in time, that she had been given not a keeper, but a partner. She had let herself hope it. That was the last hope of her old life, and she had let herself have it, and then the world came apart. Her father died. Not in war, not by any drama. A fever, a bad winter fever, 3 days and gone. The careful, gentle man who had raised her simply not there one gray morning. And Marin, 17, an orphan and an heiress, and a betrothed bride all at once, alone. And into the gap where her father had been stepped the man who unmade her father's younger brother, her uncle, Lord Farrand of Ashcombe. No, Farrand was not of Ashcombe. He had married into a lesser branch and taken the name, and had spent his whole envious life at the edge of his elder brother's rich holding, watching it, wanting it, and being nothing. And when his brother died and left it all to a girl of 17 not yet wed, Farrand saw, with the terrible clarity of a patient, envious man, the one narrow window through which he could take the whole of what he had watched his whole life and never had. For Marin was heir to Ashcombe, and Marin was betrothed to the Alpha King of the Wold, and once she was wed, Ashcombe would pass through her into the protection and reach of a king, and Farrand would be, forever, nothing, an uncle at the edge of a queen's inheritance. But she was not yet wed. There was a window, between her father's death and her marriage, a window of perhaps a season, in which Marin was only a grieving orphan girl, with no husband yet to shield her, and no father left to guard her, and in that window Farrand moved. He did not kill her. That was the thing Marin had understood only slowly, in the silence, that killing her would have been simpler, and Farrand had not done it, and the reason he had not was worse than if he had. A murdered heiress betrothed to a king is a thing a king comes north with an army to avenge. A dead bride is a war. But a bride who changes her mind, a grieving girl who, in her sorrow, turns from the world and its marriages and gives herself to God, taking the veil and the vow of silence in a holy house, renouncing her inheritance and her betrothal both for the cloister, that is not a war. That is a sad private thing. A thing that happens, a thing a disappointed king shrugs at, and a watching world believes, because girls broken by grief do turn to God, and no one looks too hard at the arrangements. So that was the theft Farrand built. In the raw first weeks of her grief, before Marin had her feet under her, he had her taken, quietly, by men she did not know, in the night, north and west across the whole country, to the grey house of the Silent Sisters, the remotest holy house in the land, a grey pile on a grey headland at the cold edge of the northern sea, an order sworn to perpetual silence and perpetual enclosure, that took women in, and did not let them out, and asked few questions of those who paid to place them there. And Farrand paid. He paid the house well to take his niece and keep her, and he told the house she had come willingly, a grief-broken girl seeking the veil, and he told the world the same, that poor Marin of Ashcombe, undone by her father's death, had renounced everything and taken the silent veil at the grey house, and would see no one, and had asked that she be left to her God. And to the one person who might have troubled the story, to Cassian, Alpha King of the Wold, whose betrothed had vanished into a cloister, Farrand sent the cruelest version of all, that Marin, in her grief, had not only turned to God, but had turned from the king specifically, had said she could not bear the northern marriage, had refused Cassian by name, and begged the silence of the veil rather than the crown of the Wold. And with Marin sealed mute and enclosed behind the grey house walls, unable to speak, unable to write, unable to send one word to contradict a syllable of it, there was no one in the world to say that any of it was a lie. And Lord Farrand took Ashcombe, the orchards, the mills, the riverland, the whole of what he had watched and wanted his whole envious life, as the nearest kin of a niece who had given the world up for God, and no one raised a hand, because the story was sad and clean and believable, and the only person who knew it for a theft was a girl of 18, tying knots in the dark of a silent cell at the edge of the northern sea. 4 years the grey house had her, and it is worth telling what those years made of her, because the woman the king would find was not the grieving girl Farrand had shut away, and the difference was the whole of the tale. The silence was the hardest thing, and it was also, in the end, the making of her. The Grey House kept the vow absolutely. The sisters spoke only in the rarest sanctioned moments, communicated by gesture, and by the small bells and by long habit, and lived out their lives in a quiet so total that Marin, in the first months, had thought it would drive her mad, had ached, physically ached, with the thousand unsaid things dammed up behind her teeth, the protest, the truth, the "I do not belong here, this is a theft, I was taken, help me," none of which she was permitted to say, and all of which would have been useless if she had, because the sisters who bound her to the silence half believed Farron's story, and the prioress wholly profited by it. She had wept, that first year, in the silence, which is a terrible way to weep, with no sound, and she had prayed in the silence, the only outlet left her, kneeling on the cold stone of her cell, and pouring out to God the whole flood of what she could say to no one. And it was in that first year, out of that silent praying, that the prayer cord had begun. She had taken a length of plain cord, and she had started, without quite deciding to, tying a knot each night when she had finished her silent prayer. One knot for each night she had survived and not broken, and the cord had become, over the 4 years, the strange center of her whole endurance. A tally, a rosary, a defiance, a record kept for no eyes but her own fingers in the dark, insisting knot by knot against the silence and the enclosure and the theft that she was still here, still herself, still counting, still, though the word would have surprised the sisters who thought her a broken penitent, still fighting. For she did not break, and the not breaking was who she became. Somewhere in the second year, the raw grief of the first burned down into something harder and more useful, and Marin stopped merely enduring the Grey House and started, quietly, mastering it. She could not speak, but she could watch, and listen, and think, and the enforced silence turned out to sharpen all three to a fineness she had never had as a chattering girl of 17. She learned the whole house, its people, its rhythms, its politics, its secrets, everything, because a silent woman who is presumed broken is a woman no one guards their doings around. And Marin, mute in her grey habit at the edge of every room, became the best-informed soul in the Grey House, precisely because everyone had forgotten she was fully a person. She learned the prioress, Mother Ceridwen, a hard worldly woman, not cruel exactly but entirely without illusions, who ran the house as much as a business as a holy place, and knew perfectly well that Marin was a paid-for inconvenience and not a true vocation, and treated her accordingly, neither kindly nor harshly, as a thing bought and to be kept. She learned the sea and the weather and the one road that led away across the moor. She learned patience, real patience, the deep strategic patience of a prisoner, which is a different thing entirely from the passive waiting the world imagines, because Marin's patience was not resignation, but siegecraft, a long cold readiness, a keeping of herself whole and sharp and informed against the day, which she never stopped believing would come, when a crack would open in the grey walls and she would need to be ready to go through it fast and clever, and on her own 2 feet. She had prayed for rescue every night for 4 years, but she had also, every night, tied a knot that meant something the sisters would never have guessed a prayer for rescue could mean. Not only please come, but I am keeping myself ready for when you do, or for when no one does, and I have to be my own. It is worth telling what the days themselves were made of, because it was in the days, the numberless identical grey days, that the true test of her not breaking lay. Not in any single dramatic cruelty, for the Grey House was not dramatically cruel, but in the slow, grinding sameness that wears a prisoner down more surely than any whip. She rose in the black before dawn to the bell, as all the sisters did, and went to the cold chapel for the first silent office, and knelt on stone, and mouthed the prayers she was not permitted to voice, and then the day's work, the herb beds or the washing, or the endless keeping of a great cold house, and the offices again at their appointed hours, the day carved into silent portions by the bell, and the poor plain meals taken in silence in the refectory, while one sister read aloud the only voice sanctioned in the whole house, and the grey afternoon, and the grey evening, and the last office, and her cell, and the knot, and the dark, and then again, and again. The sameness was the enemy. Marin had understood early that a prisoner is broken not by the hard days, but by the discovery that all the days are the same day. That nothing she does will change one grey hour of them. That she has been placed outside of time and left there. And she had fought the sameness with the one weapon a silent enclosed woman had, which was the inside of her own head. She had refused to let the days blur. She had made herself notice things. Small things, one new thing every day, a bird on the wall, the particular grey of a particular sea, the way frost took the herb beds differently in different corners, because a woman who notices is a woman still awake, still a person, still keeping the days distinct, and the blurring of the days was the beginning of the vanishing, and she would not vanish. That was the discipline under the discipline. The knots counted the nights. The noticing kept the days from becoming one long grey nothing. And between them, she held herself, for 4 years, inside of time, awake, a person, when the whole soft machinery of the enclosed silent house was built, without malice, simply by its nature, to dissolve her. There were bad stretches. She did not pretend to herself, even in the hardness she built, that she had sailed through it. There were weeks in the deep of each winter, when the grey closed down, and the sea went black, and the sameness pressed so hard that even the noticing failed her, when she lay in her cell unable to tie the knot, unable to pray, unable to do anything but stare at the stone and feel the 4 years stretch out behind, and the endless identical years stretch out ahead, and think, with a flat calm that frightened her more than despair would have, that perhaps this was simply her life now. Perhaps there was no crack coming. Perhaps she would grow old and grey and finally truly silent in this house, and be buried in its cold ground under a name that was not even properly hers, and no one would ever know she had been stolen. Those were the true bottom of it. Those flat, calm weeks, worse than the weeping first year, because the weeping at least was a kind of fighting, and the flat calm was the sameness winning. And she had come up out of each of them the same way, by the same brute act of will. She had made herself tie the knot again. Even when it meant nothing, even when she did not believe. She had reached in the dark for the cord, and tied one more knot, not because she felt the defiance the knot was supposed to mean, but precisely because she did not feel it. Because the tying was the thing that made the feeling, and not the other way round. Because a woman who keeps performing the shape of not breaking will, often enough, be carried by the shape back to the substance. The knot on the flat calm nights was the truest knot of all. It was the one tied by nothing but the bare decision not to be finished, and it was that knot, tied 100 times in the black bottom of 4 winters, that was the real reason she was still herself when the horses came. She kept, through all 4 years, one clear hard thing at the center, and it was not hope exactly, hope being too soft a word, but a kind of held certainty, that she had been stolen, that it was a lie, that Ashcombe was hers and her betrothal had been real and she had never renounced a single thing, and that the truth was true whether or not one living soul but her believed it, and that a truth kept alive by even one person is a truth not yet dead. She would not let it die. That was the deepest knot on the cord, tied fresh every night. The theft is a theft. I did not choose this. I am Marin of Ashcombe, and I am still here. She had one friend in the grey house, if the word could stretch to it, and it was the old lay sister Damaris, and it mattered that Damaris was a lay sister, and not a choir sister, because the lay sisters, the working women who kept the house's gardens and kitchens and did not take the full vows, were not bound by the perpetual silence the way the choir sisters were, and could speak, in the working parts of the day, when work required it. So Damaris could talk, and did, being constitutionally unable not to, a blunt, gnarled old woman who had kept the Grey House's herb garden for 40 years and feared neither God, nor prioress, nor the cold northern sea, and who had taken to the silent stolen girl years ago in her rough, graceless way, and had appointed herself, without anyone's leave, Marin's one human voice in a house of quiet. It was Damaris who had taught Marin the herbs, drawing her into the garden work in the second year, and it was in the garden, over the beds, in the sanctioned speech of labor, that old Damaris said, across 4 years, the few dozen blunt true things that kept Marin human. Damaris did not believe, and had never believed, the story that Marin had come to the Grey House willingly. "I've watched 40 years of women come through these walls, girl," she'd said once. Early, matter-of-fact, thinning seedlings with her gnarled thumbs. The true vocations and the dumped inconveniences both. And I know the difference in a week. The true ones come in grieving, and go quiet and find their peace, or don't, but they soften, one way or the other, into the place. You never softened. 3 years now, is it? And you're harder than the day they carried you in, and you tie that cord of yours every night like a woman keeping account she means to collect on. That's not a vocation, that's a prisoner. I don't know who put you here or why, and I'll not ask, because asking's dangerous in a house that's paid to keep you, but I know a caged thing when I've grown herbs beside one for 3 years, and you, Marin, are the most patient caged thing I ever saw, and one day, someone's going to leave a gate open, and God help them if they think that quiet means you won't go through it like a loosed hound. And Marin, who could not answer, had looked at the old woman over the herb bed with the whole of her locked-up self in her eyes, and Damaris had nodded, once, as though a thing had been said, and gone back to her seedlings, and that had been the beginning of the one friendship of Marin's captivity, an old woman who could speak, and a young one who could not, and between them, over 4 years of garden work, an understanding deeper than most people build with a lifetime of talk. It was Damaris, too, who gave Marin the one thing the Grey House could not, a way to be heard, a little, without breaking the vow. For the old lay sister, over the years, learned to read the silent girl the way Marin learned to read the house, and the two of them worked out, without ever quite deciding to, a whole private language of the garden, a tilt of the head, a way of setting down a trowel, a particular stillness, 100 small signs that let Marin say, to one person in the world, some fraction of what 4 years damned behind her teeth. It was not much. It was everything. Because the cruelest thing about the silence, Marin had found, was not the not speaking itself, but the not being heard, the sense of shouting one's whole self into a void that gave nothing back, and Damaris, by learning to read her, had given her back a sliver of the thing the theft had taken most completely, the experience of being understood by another person. A tilt of the head over the rue bed that meant I am not all right today, and an old gnarled hand landing briefly, roughly, on her shoulder in answer, that meant I know, I see it, you are not alone in it. That small exchange, repeated over 4 years of tending herbs, was the thread by which Marin stayed connected to the human world at all, and she never forgot that it was an old, unbound working woman, with no learning, and no vocation, and no reason to trouble herself, who had spun it. Out of nothing but the plain decency of refusing to let a caged girl be entirely unseen. And it was Damaris who said the thing, in the last winter, that Marin carried into everything after. Said it flatly, over the frost-killed beds, apropos of nothing, the way she said the truest things. You know what they got wrong about you, these holy women, the old lay sister had said, in 3-4 years of thinking you a broken penitent? They think the silence is what's holding you. They think if they keep you quiet long enough, the quiet becomes you, the way it's become them, and you'll settle, and forget you were ever anything but a gray thing in a gray house. But I've watched you, girl. The silence isn't holding you. You're holding it. Every day you take that vow they forced on you, and you wear it like it was your own choice, quiet and straight-backed, and giving them nothing, And that's not a broken woman keeping a rule. That's a queen keeping her own counsel in an enemy's house. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference, and one day the person who put you here is going to find it out, and I'd not want to be him on that day. And Marin, over the frozen beds, had felt the old woman's words go into her like the truest knot she ever tied, because it named the thing she had barely dared name for herself, that she was not enduring the silence but wielding it, and that a woman who wields the very thing meant to break her is a woman not yet within 1,000 miles of broken. It was in the fourth winter, in the dead cold of it, that the gate came open, and it did not come open the way Marin, in 4 years of praying, had ever imagined, quietly, by a crack she could slip through, but loudly, from the outside, with the whole weight of a king behind it. The first she knew of it was the horses. The grey house stood so remote, at the cold end of its moor road on its grey headland, that riders were a rare thing and armed riders unheard of. And when the sound of many shod horses came up the frozen moor road one grey afternoon, it went through the silent house like a struck bell, the sisters going still and wide-eyed at their work, because nothing came up that road in winter. Nothing. Marin, in the herb shed with Damaris, heard it, and felt something come up in her that she had kept knotted down for 4 years. Not hope. She had grown too hard for the easy leap to hope, but a terrible sharp attention, the caged thing's whole body turning toward the sound of the gate. And she went, with the others, drawn to the walls, and she looked down from the cold cloister at the courtyard, as the great door was opened. Mother Saradwin did not keep armed riders standing in the winter cold, whatever else she was, and she saw the men come in out of the grey, hard northern men, well-horsed and well-armed, wolf-blooded. She could feel it, the old strength coming off them into the silent holy house like heat off a fire. And at their head, swinging down off a tall grey horse into the courtyard of the grey house, a man she had seen exactly twice in her life, and had held in the silence for 4 years, older now, harder now, grey at the temples sooner than his years should have allowed, but unmistakably, impossibly, the young Alpha King who had once asked a girl of 17 about her mills, and listened to the whole answer. Cassian of the Wolde had come up the frozen moor road to the grey house of the Silent Sisters, 4 years too late, and the strangeness of it, standing at the cold rail looking down, was that Marin felt no leap of joy, nothing so simple. She felt instead the whole 4 years crash together at once, the frantic first-year knots, and the flat calm midnight knots, and every silent prayer between, and under it, a single cold clear thought, sharper than any of them. Careful. Careful now. This is the moment you kept yourself whole for, and moments like this are exactly where the unready lose everything. Do not leap, watch, see what he is before you let yourself want what he might be. 4 years of siegecraft rose up in her and steadied her hands on the cold stone, and she watched the king swing down into the courtyard with a prisoner's whole trained wariness, and did not let herself, yet, hope. And Marin stood at the cold cloister rail above the courtyard, with her prayer cord in her sleeve, and 4 years of unsaid things behind her teeth, and could not, being bound to the silence, make a single sound to tell him she was there. His coming was its own story, and Marin would piece it together only later, in the days after. But it belongs here, because it was the answer to a question she had asked in the silence 400 times. Why had he not come? For 4 years, she had knelt and prayed and tied her knots and been unable to keep out the bitterest thought of all, that her betrothed, the one power who might have troubled Pharaon's theft, had simply believed the story and shrugged and let her go, had not thought her worth a winter's ride, had taken the word that she had refused him and been, perhaps, a little relieved to be free of a southern political bride he had met but twice. That thought had been the sharpest knot on the cord, and it had been, she learned, entirely wrong, and the wrongness of it was the thing that first cracked her 4-year hardness clean across. For Cassian had not shrugged. Cassian had believed the story. That was true, and he would carry the shame of having believed it to the end of his days. But he had not shrugged at it. He had grieved it, quietly, in the hard northern way, the loss of the grave, bright southern girl who had, at their second meeting, made him think for the first time that the alliance his envoys had arranged might be, against all his expectation, a thing of the heart as well as the map. When the word came that she had taken the veil and refused him by name, he had believed it because there was no reason on the earth to doubt it. A grieving orphan girl, turning from the world to God, is the commonest sad thing there is, and a king does not ride a war-torn country to drag a woman out of a cloister she has chosen. And he had let her go, and thought of her, now and then, over 4 years, with a private regret he told no one, and gone on with his hard reign and his hard wars. What had brought him up the moor road at last was not a change of heart, but the collapse of the lie, and it had collapsed the way such lies do, from a loose thread pulled by accident. Cassian's war in the south, the long grinding business of holding the Woldes borders against the squabbling southern lords, had brought his people, that 4th winter, into the affairs of Ashcombe, and into contact with the doings of its lord, Ferrand. And Ferrand, grown fat and careless in 4 safe years on his stolen holding, had let slip, through his household, through the ordinary leakage of a guilty man who has gotten away with it too long, enough for a sharp-eared agent of the king's to catch a thread and pull it. That the Lady Maren had not come to the Vale willingly, that she had been taken, in the night, in her grief, before she could wed. That Ferrand's whole rich lordship rested on a niece sealed silent in a holy house who had never renounced a thing. That the story the king had believed for 4 years, the story of a girl who refused him for God, was a theft dressed as a vocation, built precisely so that the one man who might have avenged it would believe it and stay away. And Cassian, when the thread was pulled and the whole ugly shape of it came clear before him, had done a thing his council thought half mad in the deep of a war winter. He had left his campaign in the hands of his marshals and ridden north himself, fast and hard across the frozen country, with a picked score of men, to the remotest holy house in the land, not to send a demand but to come himself, because he had believed a lie for 4 years, and let a woman he might have loved rot behind grey walls for it. And there is a kind of debt that a king cannot discharge by proxy, that has to be paid with his own body on the cold road, and Cassian had understood that this was one. He had come to undo, with his own hands, 4 years too late, the wrong his own belief had helped to hold in place. There was a thing he carried up the moor road that Maren would learn only much later, and it changed the whole color of his coming when she learned it. That for 4 years the king had kept, without quite letting himself examine why, the small betrothal token her father's envoys had given his at the arranging of the match. A plain thing, a carved wooden disc bearing the mill and river mark of Ashcombe, the sort of token that seals an alliance and is meant to be set aside once the marriage makes it moot. When the word came that she had taken the veil and refused him, a sensible man would have burned it, or sent it back, or forgotten it in a drawer. Cassian had kept it. He had carried it 4 years, through a war, telling himself it was nothing, a scrap of wood, a closed matter, and had taken it out, now and then, in the hard nights of his campaigns, and turned it over, and thought of the grave bright girl, who had asked him nothing, and told him about her mills, and put it away again unexamined. And when the thread was pulled and he understood at last that she had never refused him, that she had been taken and sealed and silenced, the first thing he had done, before the council, before the ride, before anything, was take out the carved wooden disc and understand, finally, why he had kept it 4 years. Because some part of him, wiser than his believing, had never quite closed the matter, had held the token the way she was, at that very hour a country away, holding a knotted cord in the dark. 2 people neither of whom would let a stolen thing be finished, each keeping a small worn object against a hope they had both stopped admitting to, across 4 years and the whole width of a kingdom, without either knowing the other did the same. He had come to claim the bride the world had told him refused him, having learned at last that she had never refused him at all, and had been praying, every silent night for 4 years, in a cell at the edge of the sea, for exactly this. He did not simply carry her off, and that was the first thing that told Marin the man in the courtyard was not the instrument of yet another powerful person's will, but something she had stopped believing the world contained. There was a hard hour in the Grey House first, because Mother Saradwin did not give up a paid-for inconvenience easily, and the prioress met the Alpha King in her cold stone parlor, with the whole worldly weight of a woman defending her house's arrangements. The Lady Marin had taken the veil, freely, years past. She was enclosed, and vowed, and could not simply be ridden off with by armed men, king or no king. The house had its rights and its rule and its patrons' trust to keep. And Marin, who had contrived, in the confusion, to be among the sisters brought to the cold parlor's edge, stood mute against the wall, and watched her whole fate argued over her head by a king and a prioress, as though she were a bond in dispute, and not a woman in the room, and felt the old fury of 4 years rise up in her, because this exactly, was the shape of the whole theft. Powerful people deciding Marin of Ashcombe's life in her hearing, and never once turning to ask Marin of Ashcombe what she wanted. The uncle who shut her away, and the prioress who kept her, and now even the king who had come to free her, all of them talking about her over her silent head. And Cassian stopped it. That was the thing. In the middle of the prioress's smooth worldly argument, the Alpha King of the Wolda held up one hand and stopped her, and turned away from the powerful woman he was negotiating with, and toward the row of silent gray sisters against the wall, toward the mute figure he had not been certain, until that turning, was even among them. And he looked at Marin, really looked. 4 years older and gray-habited, and locked in a silence he did not yet understand the depth of, and he did the one thing no one had done in 4 years. He asked her. "I have been speaking," he said, "to the prioress, but looking at Marin, as though the Lady Marin's will were a thing for you and me to settle between us, and I have just heard how that sounds, and I am ashamed of it, because it is the very thing that was done to her 4 years ago, and I'll not be one more voice that does it. So I'll not ask the prioress whether the Lady Marin stays or goes. I'll ask the Lady Marin." And he crossed the cold parlor, past the astonished prioress, and stood before the silent gray figure against the wall, and said, low, only to her, "I was told 4 years ago that you refused me, and chose this place. I believed it. That is my shame, and I will carry it. 3 days past, I learned it was a lie, that you were taken, and sealed here silent, so you could not say otherwise, and that your uncle holds Ashcombe on the strength of a vocation you never had. I have ridden here to undo it, if you want it undone. But I will not carry you out of one prison on my own say-so and call it rescue, because that is only a kinder theft, and you have had enough done to you without your leave. So," and he held her eyes, the Alpha King kneeling his whole authority down to the level of a mute woman's actual wishes. "I know you cannot speak. I know what house this is. But you can answer me some way. A sign, a nod, your own hand, and I will take the answer from your own self and no one else's. Do you want to leave this place? Not because I've come. Because you choose it. Tell me, however you can, and whatever you tell me is what we'll do." And Marin, who had prayed for rescue every silent night for 4 years, and had never once, in 400 imagined versions of it, imagined that the rescue would arrive and then ask her permission. Marin stood against the cold stone wall with 4 years of unsaid things behind her teeth, and did the only thing she could, which turned out to be the truest thing she had done in 4 years. She did not simply nod. She reached into her sleeve and drew out the prayer cord, the heavy knotted length of it, 4 winters of knots, and she held it up between them in the cold parlor light so that he could see it, the thousands of small hard knots, and she pressed it into the Alpha King's hand and folded his fingers over it, the way, though he could not know it, her own mother's story had once folded a crown into a fleeing girl's hand, and she looked at him, and though she could not say one word, she made her whole silent self say the thing the cord meant, 4 years of it, Every not a night she had knelt and prayed to be asked exactly this question. And then, holding his eyes, she nodded, once, hard, and it was not the nod of a rescued girl accepting rescue. It was the nod of Maren of Ashcombe, who had kept herself whole and ready in the silence for 4 years, precisely so that when the gate came open, she could walk through it of her own will, choosing, at last, out loud in the only voice they had left her, to go. She set her condition before they had ridden a mile from the grey house, and it came out not in speech, because her speech did not come back in a day. 4 years of silence do not lift like a lifted latch, and Maren found, that first day, that her voice was a rusted, stiff, frightening thing she did not yet trust, and could not yet command, so that she rode away from her prison still, for a while, in the silence it had taught her. But she had other ways now, ways the house had never let her use, and on the first night's camp, in the firelight, with the grey house a day behind them, she took a scrap of char from the fire's edge and a flat pale stone and she wrote. She could write. The theft had not taken her letters, only her tongue, and she wrote out her condition in a plain, hard hand and passed the stone across the fire to the Alpha King, because a woman who has been decided for her whole captivity will set her terms before she rides 1 more mile toward anyone's protection, in whatever voice she has. The stone said, before anything, you'll not decide my life and tell me after. Not Ashcombe, not Farrand, not the marriage, not what becomes of me. 4 years everyone decided me over my head. I'll be asked, or I'll make my own way from here alone. Swear it. She had thought about that condition for 4 years before she had a hand free to write it, which was a strange thing to realize as she scratched it out, that she had composed it, and revised it, and honed it, over 400 silent nights, against the day she might be able to set terms to anyone at all. In the cell it had been a kind of game she played, to keep her mind sharp, imagining the moment the gate opened, and exactly what she would demand of whoever stood in it, and the demand had always come down to the same thing, refined over the years to its hardest core, not freedom, though she wanted freedom, not Ashcombe, though it was hers, but the right to be asked. Because Maren had understood, in 4 years of watching herself be decided for, that freedom handed to you by someone who then arranges your grateful life is not freedom at all, only a change of keeper, and that the one thing the theft had truly taken from her, more than her holding, more than her betrothal, more even than her voice, was her standing as a person whose wants were consulted before her life was disposed of. Farrand had not asked, the prioress had not asked, the world that believed the lie had not asked. 4 years, and not one soul had turned to Maren of Ashcombe and said, "What do you want?" And the not being asked had become, in her mind, the very definition of the wrong, so that when she finally had a scrap of char, and a flat stone, and a man across a fire who had, astonishingly, already begun to ask, she wrote the condition she had honed for 4 years, and it was not a plea, and not a thank you, but a hard flat demand for the one thing she had sworn in the silence she would never again live without. And Cassian read it in the firelight, the whole hard economy of it, 4 years pressed into 6 lines of char on stone, and he did not give her a smooth king's answer, because he had already understood, in the cold parlor, that she was not a woman a smooth answer would reach. He took the char from her hand, asked for it, with a look, first, and he wrote his own word beneath hers on the pale stone, because it seemed right to answer her in the voice she had, and he passed it back, and it said, "I swear it." He had written only that, and then, aloud, low, across the fire, he had added the rest. "Every choice that's yours, you'll make. The uncle, the holding, the marriage most of all. I did not ride north to trade one man's arrangement of you for my own. I'll say it plainly so there's no mistaking. I have not come to claim a bride who was promised me and stolen, though the world would grant me the right. I've come to give a stolen woman back her own choosing, and if her choosing is Ashcombe and not the wold, a life of her own and not a marriage to me, then that's what my swords are for, and I'll set you in your own hall as its own lady, and ride home to my war alone, and count the ride north well spent. You were promised to me once by your father and your envoys, in the old way, over your head. That promise died with the theft. If there's ever to be another, it'll be one you make yourself, in your own voice, when you have your voice again, or there'll be none, and either way you'll have Ashcombe and your freedom, because those are yours by right and not by my gift. Ask, every time, that's sworn. And Marin sat across the fire with the pale stone in her hands and read the word he'd written under hers, I swear it, and felt the first knot of 4 years' worth begin, very slowly, to loosen. They did not ride hard for Ashcombe to have the reckoning done, and that was the second thing that told her Cassian was not the man 4 years of theft had trained her to expect. The sensible thing, the king's thing, would have been to carry her south at speed, confront Farrand, force the truth, and set the stolen heir back in her hall while the winter roads still held. Instead, he asked her, wrote it, that first while, on the pale stone, and later asked it aloud once her voice began to come. How she wished to do it, and when she made him understand that 4 years in a silent cell did not undo in a week of riding, that she could not go from the grey house to a public reckoning with the man who had stolen her life, without some ground between, some time to become a person again before she had to become a claimant, he simply nodded, and did not argue, and turned the hard-fast rescue into a slow one. He brought her, not to his great hall in the Wolde where a court would stare at the recovered lost bride, but to a small quiet holding of his own in the near country, a modest stone house in a sheltered fold, half-staffed and private, where a woman 4 years silent could learn, out of everyone's sight, how to have a voice and a life again, and where, because it was small and quiet, the Alpha King kept finding reasons, to his marshal's open despair, to spend far more of a war winter than any war winter could spare. He did not court her. She had no defenses left worth the name after 4 years, and a courting would have frightened what defenses she had, and besides, she could not yet have borne it, being still half in the silence, still flinching from her own returning voice. What he did instead was the thing he had done in the parlor and at the fire. He asked, and he waited, and he left every door on her side, and he let her come back to herself at her own pace and not his, and her voice came back slowly, over that quiet winter, and the coming back of it was the strangest and most private thing, and he was the one who was there for it. The first words were the hardest. She found, appallingly, that after 4 years the very act of making sound to another person felt like a transgression, felt dangerous, felt like a thing that would be punished. So deep had the silence gone into her, and she would get a word to the edge of her teeth and it would die there. 4 years of do not speak stronger than her will. And Cassian, who had somehow understood this without being told, never once pushed, never once said speak, never finished a sentence for her, or filled her silences, or made her voicelessness a thing to be gotten past. He simply spoke to her, easily, and left the spaces open, and let her fill them or not as she could, and treated each small returning word, when it came, not as an event to be remarked, but as the most ordinary thing in the world, so that speaking to him came, over the winter, to feel not like a transgression, but like the one safe place a 4-year silence could safely end. The slow winter of that small holding was the long heart of it, and it was made of the smallest things, and Marin, who had spent 4 years starved of exactly the small ordinary human things, found herself undone, not by any grand gesture. She learned him in the daily work, because he could not sit idle while another person labored, and neither, after 4 years of the grey house's discipline, could she, and so they shared the keeping of the small house, and it was in the sharing that her wall came down stone by stone, so slowly she did not feel it fall. She learned that the feared Alpha King of the Wolde split his own wood and hauled his own water and mended the small broken things of the holding with his own hands, and asked her leave before he touched a thing that was becoming, in the quiet house, hers. May I? Would you rather I didn't? and did the one thing she pointed to and not the others, because she had pointed to the one. She learned that he was privately quiet and dry, and carried his hard reign more heavily than he let his people see, that he had come young to a hard crown after a bad war she pieced together only slowly, and had made himself into what the wold needed, and been, mostly, alone in it. She learned the particular grave attention he brought to everything, the way he had once, at 17, brought it to her answer about the mills, that he was a man who did not do things by halves, who listened all the way to the end, who when he gave you his attention, gave you the whole of it, and that this was the same quality that had ridden him north through a war winter and would not let him send a proxy, a man made all of one piece. And she gave him, over that winter, in the returning voice, the thing she had given no one in 4 years, because there had been no one, and because she had had no voice, she told him. Not all at once, and not easily, but over the slow weeks, in the shared work and by the evening fire, Marin told the Alpha King the whole of the 4 years, the theft, the night they carried her north, the first terrible year of silent weeping, the prayer cord, and what each knot had meant, the long cold mastery of the 2nd and 3rd years, the way she had kept herself whole and ready against a day she had never stopped believing in, and had stopped, in the 4th year, quite hoping for. She had carried it all alone, in the silence, for 4 years, and the carrying alone had made it a stone, and telling it now, aloud, in her rusty returning voice, to a man who listened the way he listened to everything, without pity, which she could not have borne, but with a grave, steady attention that took the whole weight of it seriously, telling it did to the 4 years what speaking always does to a thing carried too long in silence. It made them, at last, only what they were, a hard, cruel human wrong that had been done to her, and that she had survived, and not the private, unspeakable thing they had become behind her teeth. She found she could set the stone down, telling him, she had not known, until she began, how much she had needed to. There was a particular evening she kept afterward, of all the evenings of that winter, because it was the one where she understood what he was doing with the silence, and understood that he understood it better than she did herself. She had been struggling, that evening, with a word, some small, ordinary word, she never remembered which, that had stuck behind her teeth the way words still stuck. 4 years of do not speak, rising up to strangle the simplest thing, and she had felt the old panic come, the flush of shame at her own broken voice, the urge to give up and fall back into the safe silence where nothing was expected of her. And Cassian, across the small fire, had not helped her with the word, had not looked away to spare her, had not done any of the things that would have told her that her struggle was a thing to be embarrassed by. He had simply waited, easily, with the whole of his patience, the way he had waited outside a goat fold, and outside a parlor, and outside every locked door of her, and let her get the word out in her own time, and when it came he had received it as though it were the most ordinary word in the world, which it was, and gone on. And afterward, when she could, she had made herself ask him. It took 3 tries to get the question out, why he never helped, never filled the silence, when she could see it cost him something to sit and watch her fight for a word he could have handed her in an instant. And he had thought about it, in his slow way, and said, because the words are yours. 4 years, someone took them, and if I hand them back to you, even kindly, even to spare you the struggle, then I'm one more person managing your voice for you, and you'll never quite believe the voice is yours again. It has to cost you. That's the only way it comes back all the way. You fighting the word out yourself, and me not rescuing you from it, so that when the word finally comes it's yours, fought for, and not a thing I gave you. I'd rather sit a whole winter watching you struggle for words, than hand you one, and have you always wonder, after, whether you can really speak, or only repeat what's put in your mouth. And Marin had sat by the fire with that, and understood that the Alpha King had thought harder about the returning of her voice than she had, that his patience was not mere kindness, but a precise and deliberate refusal to be one more person who decided her, even in so small a mercy as finishing a sentence. And it had reached the deepest and most locked part of her, the part 4 years of being decided for had bricked shut, and loosened it another turn. She learned the small domestic truths of him that winter, the ones no one else in the Waldy knew, because no one else had seen the Alpha King live for a season in a half-staffed holding. She learned that he ate whatever the small kitchen set down, and thanked whoever set it, that he could not abide a task left half-finished, and would stay at a thing past sense to see it clean, that he was easier in the small house than in his own great hall, because in the small house there was only the work and the weather, and the one woman who had told him to his face she would take Ashcombe and her freedom over his crown, and no court, no marshals, no weight of a kingdom watching to see the king be a king. She learned to read his silences, which was a skill 4 years had made her the master of. She who had lived 4 years in a house of silence could read a quiet the way other people read speech, and she found that Cassian's silences were not empty but full, that he said a great deal without words if you knew how to hear it, and that the two of them, the king who chose his words, and the woman learning hers back, communicated in the winter house as much in the quiet as in the speech, and that this too was a kind of ease she had never had with anyone, a fluency in silence shared with someone who valued it as she had been forced to. She learned, most dangerously, that she was easy with him. That was the thing that got past all the rest. 4 years the silence had made her flinch from her own voice, from being known, from the danger of being a person in front of other people. And with Cassian, slowly, over a winter of shared work and asked first courtesies, and a returning voice he never once rushed, the flinch eased into its opposite, into the unfamiliar ease of being near someone before whom she did not have to be anything at all, not the silent penitent, nor the stolen heir, nor the recovered bride, only Marin, which was a person she had almost forgotten she was allowed to be. She caught herself, one evening deep in the winter, laughing. A real laugh, surprised out of her by something dry he'd said, the first laugh in 4 years, and the sound of it in her own long silent throat shocked her, so that she stopped, appalled, her hand going to her mouth. And Cassian had looked at her with an expression that was not triumph, and not pity, but something quiet and stunned. The look of a man who has heard a thing he did not know he was waiting for, and had said only, very low, "There it is," and gone back to his work, and left her by the fire with her hand over her mouth, and her whole 4-year wall gone quietly to rubble without her having felt a single stone of it fall. The test came before the confession did, as it so often does, and it wore the shape of the world's convenience, which had never once in Marin's life bent to accommodate Marin. It came in the person of a high-born woman of the Wolda's court, named Lady Isought, clever and polished and long accustomed to think herself the natural future queen of the Wolde, who had heard, as courts hear everything, that the Alpha King had ridden north in the dead of a war winter, and come back not with a captured enemy, but with a silent southern woman he had housed in a private holding and could not seem to leave, and who came to the small house, all warmth and grace, to take the measure of her rival. Isought was not crude. She was far too clever for that. She was gracious and admiring, and every graceful word she spoke was a small, precise blade, aimed at exactly the wound she had guessed the recovered woman carried. How remarkable, Isought said, that poor Marin had survived. How the silence must have marked her. How strange it must be to try to re-enter the world after so long shut away from it, to learn again how to be among people, to speak, to be a lady of a court, when one had been, for 4 years, a mute thing in a cell. And did the Lady Marin find it very hard, the speaking? One noticed she was so quiet still, and of course the king was kindness itself to take such trouble over a broken thing, but a kingdom did need a queen who could stand at its center and hold a court and speak, and one did wonder, gently, kindly, whether 4 years of silence left a woman quite equal to that, whatever the pity of her case. Every soft, admiring word was calculated to make Marin feel the precise thing she most feared: that the silence had unfitted her, that she was damaged goods, a mute, broken penitent that a kind king had rescued out of decency, and that everyone could see she would never be equal to the world she was being handed back. And it worked, for a bad hour, because it aimed at a real wound. Marin, listening to the polished lady's gracious blades in her own still returning voice, felt the 4 years rise up in her like a thing that showed, felt every silent cell-bound day, and heard under Isat's warm voice the old cold verdict of the theft. You are less now. They made you less. You will never be equal to your own life again. She felt herself begin, in the fine lady's presence, to shrink back toward the silence, toward the flinch, toward the mute gray thing the gray house had tried to make her. And that was the test, though it came in silk and not in chains, and it was Cassian's response and her own that showed the shape of them both. For Cassian saw it, and his first instinct, she watched it move across his hard face, was the Alpha's, to step in, to put the king's whole weight between Marin and the lady's blades, to declare the recovered heir under his protection and esteem, and end the thing. And Marin stopped him, with a look, a small hard shake of her head, because she had understood, in the bad hour of shrinking, the thing that mattered. Later, when Isat had gone, she told him, in her own voice, which she made herself use precisely because using it was the point, "If you defend me, then I am forever what she thinks I am." A broken, silent thing the king speaks for, because she cannot speak for herself. I was made mute for 4 years, so that I could not contradict a lie about my own life, and I will not come out of that silence, only to have you be my voice, however kindly. Her whole art is to make me feel the silence unfit me. The one thing that answers it is not a king vouching that I'm equal to my life. It's me, being equal to it, out loud, in the voice they tried to take. And when Isat came again, for such women always come again, Marin did not shrink, and did not let Cassian shield her, and answered the polished blades herself, in the rusty 4 years silent voice she was learning, word by word, to trust. She did it quietly, because the silence had taught her, if nothing else, the weight of a thing said sparingly. "You keep telling me," Marin said, into one of Isawut's gracious admirings, "how the silence must have damaged me, how it must have left me less than equal to a court, and I have worked out at last, that you mean it for a wound, so let me take the wound away from you. You think 4 years of silence made me less. It did the opposite. Do you know what a person learns, Lady Isaut, in 4 years of being unable to say one word, 4 years of watching, and listening, and thinking, with the tongue stopped and nothing left to do but see? She learns to hear everything. She learns what people are under what they say, because she has nothing but the watching to go on. She learns that most of what is spoken in a court is noise, and that the person who says least sees most, and that a woman who has learned to hold 4 years of truth behind her teeth without breaking is not less equal to standing at the center of a court. She is more, immeasurably more, than a woman who has never once in her life had to keep silent about anything. She looked at the polished lady, and 4 years of surviving what should have broken her made her impossible, now, to shrink. "You came here to make me feel the silence unfit me for a crown. You have only reminded me that I spent 4 years learning, against my will, the one thing most people who wear crowns never learn at all: how to be quiet, and watch, and know. I am not less for the silence, lady. I am the most dangerous thing there is, a woman who learned to listen, and I promise you, in the years I spent learning it, I heard a great many voices exactly like yours, and I know precisely what they are." She let the quiet sit, the way 4 years had taught her to let a quiet do its work, and then she added, not unkindly, because being unable to speak for 4 years had taught her also to spend her few words with care, and never waste them on cruelty. "You've been the natural queen of this court your whole life, and you're clever, and you'd have worn it well, and I'm sorry a stolen mute nobody rode down out of a gray house and undid all of that in a winter. Truly, That's a hard thing. But you keep speaking of the crown as a thing owed to the woman equal to holding a court, the graceful one, the practiced one, the one who was never damaged. And you've mistaken the whole nature of the thing. A crown isn't held by the woman who's most equal to a court. It's held by the woman who won't be broken by what comes at her, and knows, in her bones, what it is to be the powerless one in the room, because those are the people a crown is finally for. I spent 4 years as the most powerless person in a house full of the powerful. I will never, wearing any crown, forget for 1 hour what it is to be the silent one no one asks. You have never been powerless a day in your life, lady, and you offer that to me as your qualification. It is precisely your disqualification, and you cannot hear it, and that is the surest proof of it. And Lady Aesop's polished face did the complicated thing, and found nothing to say, because there is no answer to a woman who takes the wound you aimed at her, and turns it, in front of you, into her armor. And Marin, watching the fine lady find no words, understood a thing that steadied her for good. That she, the 4 years silent one, had just won an exchange of words with the most practiced tongue at the northern court, and had won it not despite the silence but with it, with the weight and aim and economy the silence had ground into her, and that Damaris had been exactly right. Over the frost-killed beds, the silence was not holding her. She was holding it, and she had just, for the first time, turned it outward as a weapon in the open world, and it had cut clean. And Cassian, who had held himself from defending her, looked at Marin with an expression that was not a king's at all, that was naked, and astonished, and close to worship, the look of a man watching the person he loves refuse, in her own hard-won voice, to be made small by the very thing that had been done to make her small. It broke fully the night the reckoning with Ferrand came, and it was Cassian who held her through it, and it was that night that took down the last of her wall. For the slow winter could not last forever, and the spring came, and with it the thing that could not be put off any longer, the ride south to Ashcombe, to confront the uncle who had stolen her life, to set the truth in front of the world, and take her holding back. And Marin, who had spent a winter becoming a person again, found as the going drew near, that the nearer it came, the more the 4 years pressed at the wall she had built over them, because Ferrand was not just a thief to be confronted, Ferrand was the whole of the wrong, the man who had looked at a grieving orphan girl and decided to bury her alive in silence for a holding, and to ride back toward him was to ride back toward the raw center of everything the winter had let her set down. And it came due the night before the confrontation, in the field camp within sight of Ashcombe's mills, when the whole of the 4 years she had carried, and finally spoken but not yet fully grieved, came up in her at once. And it woke, as such things do in the old blood, the wolf. For Marin was wolf-blooded too, of the old southern line of Ashcombe, and the grey house, like all the houses of that severe order, had bound its women's wolves as part of the enclosure, forbidden the change, kept the animal caged as thoroughly as the tongue. 4 years her wolf had been held down in the silence along with everything else, and now, on the eve of facing the man who had caged them both, the grief and the loosed wolf together came up and dragged her under. 4 years of unwept silent rage and sorrow breaking the bindings all at once. The wolf rising disoriented and starving after 4 years caged with no anchor, no pack, nothing to run beside. And it was going to take her, the fever of grief and the loosed animal together, and she had no anchor, had never had one, had made a whole silent captivity out of needing no one, because there had been no one to need. And it was Cassian who became one. He did the thing an alpha does, the thing no one had done for Marin in the whole of her stolen life. He anchored her. Through the worst of that night, when the grief and the loosed wolf together were pulling her under, he stayed, and held her, old blood to old blood, gave her waking wolf an older, steadier wolf to run beside instead of drowning, and he did not let go through the whole of it, and it is no small danger to hold a wolf loosed wild after 4 years caged, and he did not let go. And Marin, going under into the grief she had never fully let herself feel, reached in her delirium for the anchor of him, the way a drowning swimmer reaches for the one solid thing, and clung, and did not drown, because he was there. And she came back to herself in the gray before dawn, wrung out and hollow and alive, wrapped in the arms of the Alpha King of the Wolde. Her long-caged wolf settled for the first time in 4 years because it had, at last, another wolf to anchor to, and the whole unwept silence finally poured out of her, 4 years of it, in sound. She wept aloud, at last, with a voice, great racking sounds she had not been permitted to make in 4 years of silent grieving, and she understood, with something like terror, that she had needed him, in the night, absolutely, that the whole proud architecture of 4 years' self-sufficient silence had come down in a single night, and that being held through the dark by someone who would not let go, was not weakness, but the very thing she had knelt and prayed for, in the silence, every night for 4 years, without ever quite letting herself name it as more than prayer. And neither of them let go. That was the thing. The grief had crested, the wolf was settled, there was no anchoring need, any more, for the king to hold her. And neither of them let go. And it was Marin, in the end, wrung out and raw and without a wall at last, who looked up at the hard, astonishing face of the man who had held her through the night and not let go, and said, in a voice wrecked and honest and wholly, finally, her own, "You held on. All night. You could have been hurt, holding a wolf that hadn't loosed in 4 years, and you knew it, and you held on anyway. Why?" And Cassian, Alpha King of the Wold, who had never in his hard life said a soft thing aloud, did not fail to say it now. "Because there's no version of my life," he said, low, certain, "where I hold you through the worst night of 4 years' grief and let go at the safe moment. I told myself riding north that it was a debt, a wrong my own believing had helped to hold in place, an honor to be paid. It was a debt, at the start. It stopped being a debt the night you passed me a scrap of stone across a fire with 6 lines of char on it, and would not ride 1 more mile toward my protection without setting your own terms first. A woman 4 years silenced who came out of the silence, bargaining like the last free soul in the world. It was never the promise I came to keep, Marin. It was you. The woman who tied 4 years of knots in the dark and did not break, who kept herself whole and ready in a silence meant to erase her, who came out of it not less but more. I'd have wanted her whether or not she was ever promised to me. The old promise only told me where to ride. What I found at the end of the road wasn't a bride owed to me. It was the one person I've met in a hard life of ruling, who had every reason the world could give to be broken, and instead had made herself, in the silence, into the least broken thing I ever saw. And there was nothing walled left in either of them, no king and no stolen heir, only 2 hard people who had each built a life out of needing no one, and found, in each other, the one person worth needing. And when he kissed her it was not gentle, exactly, and not fierce, exactly, it was certain. The way a thing survived is certain. And she kissed him back with the wolf that had at last stopped being alone, and the voice that had at last come home, and the prayer cord, which he had carried, every day since the parlor, folded in his own breast, 4 years of her knots against his heart, lay between them and meant, now, not 4 years of unanswered prayer, but 4 years of prayer answered, late and not too late at once. Damaris, for old Damaris, had left the grey house when Marin left it, having decided, in her blunt way, that 40 years of the Silent Sisters was enough, and that a stolen girl walking free needed one familiar face on the road more than the herb garden needed her. Found them in the grey after-grief dawn, and looked at the pair of them a long moment, and said only, in her flat, blunt way, "Well, 4 years I watched you tie that cord and not break, girl, and I always said someone would leave a gate open, and God help them if they thought quiet meant tame. Took a king and a whole war winter, but you got there, and you got there on your own 2 feet like I knew you would. Now the both of you sleep, before the queen of the Wolde falls off her horse on the way to take her own holding back and makes a liar of the old woman who always said that Silent One was the strongest thing in the house. And she paused at the edge of the firelight, and her gnarled old face did the almost gentle thing that on Damaris was rare as summer on that gray headland. I never asked who put you there, girl. 4 years. Because asking was dangerous in a house paid to keep you, and because I thought the not asking was the only kindness I had to give. I'm sorry it was so little. And Marin, in her own voice now, said, "It wasn't little, Damaris. You were the one voice they didn't take from me. 4 years, you talked to me over the herb beds like I was a whole person, when everyone else in that house had decided I was a broken one. You kept me human. That's not little, that's the thing that let me not break." And the old woman's face worked, and she said nothing, which for Damaris was a great deal, and stumped off to see to the horses, and left them the dawn. It was 2 summers after the king rode up the frozen moor road that Marin stood at the window of the great hall of Ashcombe, in the long gold evening light, her own hall, her father's hall, taken back, and watched the mills turn on the river below, and thought about the girl who had knelt in a silent cell at the edge of the sea, and tied a knot each night for a rescue she had stopped hoping would come. The reckoning with Ferrand was long past, and it can be told briefly because it was not, in the end, the heart of the tale. The truth, once a king carried it, could not be resisted. The theft came apart the moment there was anyone with the power and the will to say aloud what Marin had known alone for 4 years. Ferrand, who had held Ashcombe on nothing but a lie and the silence of the one woman who could contradict it, found that a lie is a poor wall against a stolen heir who has her voice back and a king at her side, and he answered, at last, for what he had done, and Ashcombe came back to the hand it had been left to. It did not give Marin back the 4 years, nothing could. But it gave her back her holding, and her name, and the things she had not let herself hope for, her voice, out loud, in her own hall, where the whole world that had believed the lie could hear the truth from her own mouth, and that was the thing she had knelt and prayed for in the silence, and having it was stranger, and larger, and harder than she had imagined, and she wept once, when it was done, for the girl of 18 who had needed it and not had it, and then she was done weeping, and she was free. Cassian came and stood beside her at the window, the way he did, and they watched the mills turn below in the gold light, and after a while he asked her, quietly, the question he had never quite asked, the one he always left in her hands. "Do you ever wish the thread had never been pulled, that my agent had never caught it, and I'd gone on believing the lie, and you'd stayed?" "No. That's a cruel question, and I know it, and I'll ask the true one under it. Do you ever wish it had been anyone but me who came? That the man who rode up your moor road had been a stranger who freed you and let you go, and not the one you'd been promised to over your head, so that the freeing didn't come tangled up in an old arrangement you never chose. Sometimes I think I gave you back your life and asked for a place in it in the same breath, and that you can't ever be sure you chose the second freely, having so needed the first." And Marin, who had made him swear to ask and not decide, and had learned in the years since to hold herself to the same law, told him the truth, in her own words, out loud, the way she had earned the right to. "You're asking whether I can tell the difference between being grateful and choosing," she said. "It's a fair question. It's the question 4 years in that cell taught me to ask about everything, because gratitude was the trap they wanted. A rescued girl so thankful she never notices she's still being handed her life by someone else. So I'll answer it carefully, because you've earned a careful answer. When you came up that moor road, I was grateful. Yes, 4 years of prayer answered. Of course I was grateful, and if you had carried me off on the strength of that gratitude, and married me while I was still weak with it, I'd never have known whether I chose you, or only clung to the first hand that reached into the cell. But you didn't. That's the whole of it. You put a scrap of stone in my hand and swore you'd ask and decide nothing for me. You housed me a winter, and let me get my own voice back before you'd hear one word about a marriage. You handed me Ashcombe free and clear, and told me to my face you'd ride home alone, and count it well spent if that was my choosing. You spent 2 years making certain I could choose you, or not, from strength, and not from gratitude, and that, Cassian, is the thing that lets me answer you now with no doubt in it at all. She turned to him, to the king who had ridden a war winter, and held her wolf through the dark, and not let go. You ask if I wish a stranger had come instead. No, I choose this. Not the theft. I didn't choose the theft. No one chooses to be buried alive in silence for a holding, and it took 4 years I'll never get back. But this, being asked instead of decided, being heard instead of silenced, being held through the dark instead of praying through it alone, standing at this window in my father's hall, with my own voice in my mouth and a hole holding safe below me, and you beside me, mark it, never in front, instead of tying knots in a cell for a rescue that never came. I choose all of it, the crown of the Wolde, and the keeping of Ashcombe, and the hard work of both, because it's mine, chosen, out loud, and I am. And for once she did not let the sentence trail off. I am not the silent one anymore. I never truly was. I was only Marin of Ashcombe, keeping herself whole in the quiet, waiting to be asked one honest question. And you rode a winter to ask it, and I have my answer, and it is yes, and I say it in my own voice, which is the one thing in all of this that no one gave me, and no one can take. Yes, I choose this. I choose you. And Cassian took her hand, and they stood together at the window of Ashcombe in the long gold light, and Marin reached into the small box she kept now on the sill, not hidden, a thing she owned openly, and drew out the prayer cord, the heavy knotted length of it, 4 winters of knots, and turned it over in her hands, the way she did sometimes now, reading the years in it with her thumb, the frantic knots of the first year that still believed, the hard, patient knots of the middle years that had stopped believing and gone on anyway, the last knots of the 4th winter, tied the very week he came. Beside the cord in the box lay the small carved wooden disc, the mill and river mark of Ashcombe, that Cassian had carried 4 years and given back to her on the road south, the 2 worn tokens side by side now on the sunlit sill, his and hers, the disc he had kept, and the cord she had tied, the twin proofs that across 4 years, and the whole width of a kingdom, neither of them had let the stolen thing be finished. She had put them together the day they came home, and she left them together, because they belonged together, the way the 2 people who had kept them did. She had kept the cord. She would keep it always. She had thought once, in the cell, that if rescue ever came, she would burn the cord, be rid of the count of her captivity, and instead, she found she wanted it there, on the sunlit sill of her own hall, to the last of her days, because it was not, she had come to understand, the record of a rescue she had waited on. It was the record of a woman who had not broken. Every not a night she had knelt in the silence and refused to disappear, had insisted, to a God she wasn't sure heard, and a world she wasn't sure remembered. I am still here. I have not broken. Tie another. 4 years of still here. It had not been a prayer for a man to come, in the end, or not only that. It had been a prayer to remain herself until someone did. Or until no one did, and she had to be her own rescue, and she had remained herself, all 4 years, knot by knot, and that was hers, and no king had given it, and no uncle had taken it, and she would keep the proof of it in the gold light on her own windowsill forever. And as the evening bell rang out over Ashcombe, a real bell, rung aloud, not the muffled signals of a silent house, but a full glad bell ringing over turning mills and a free holding, Marin of Ashcombe, who had prayed 4 years in silence, and kept her own voice through all of it, stood in the sound of it with the cord warm in her hands, and did not pray, and did not keep silent, but only listened to the bell ring out loud over the life she had chosen, in the end, entirely for herself.